欢迎收看《家国纵横》，我是康凯。家中关系近年陷入历史的低谷，在经历3年的新冠疫情，更是雪上加霜。双边的贸易可谓举步维艰，受影响的当然是两国的金融、生产、服务、运输等行业的主管以及工作人员，交易量也大幅的下跌，前景是否并不乐观呢？目前虽然新冠疫情已经全面的减退，不过家中两国又陷入地缘政治的危机、通货膨胀、经济低迷等多种的因素当中。什么时候才可以走出阴霾，恢复两国贸易的积极互动，促进双边的利益呢？加拿大是最早承认并且与中华人民共和国建立外交关系的西方国家之一。50多年来，两国无论民间交往还是商贸往来都密切频繁。不过，新冠疫情全球爆发的2020年，也就是家中建立外交关系50周年之际，双边关系就因2018年12月加拿大应美国引渡要求拘押中国华为财务总监孟晚舟而陷入历史冰点。外界一直在关注随之而来持续3年的疫情是否又雪上加霜，令家中两国的商界合作与交流步履维艰。
I think tourism, of course, cultural industries, anything where you might have been doing, say, live shows or things. And ideologically, it's also gotten much more challenging on the culture side. And also services. So if you're doing financial services and you have operations in China, that might be okay. But if you were doing, capital markets or legal or accounting based on deal volume is way down. And that's not just for the pandemic. Part of it is the pandemic. We have a mission that is more and better business between Canada and China. And so certainly how we help more business happen changed during the pandemic because of the travel restrictions. So no delegations, no members traveling and meeting with our offices in China. There was no business development, really, unless you had a team on the ground already. So we had to adapt and work on capacity building in Canada, which was always a problem. A lot of companies aren't ready to go to China, so we were able to use that to help do more training and help companies that way, as well as to help them resolve some of the problems they had with China. Like some had team members who needed to go back.
家中贸易理事会目前拥有超过300家在中国市场活跃以及有意开拓中国市场的加拿大企业会员，涉及领域包括农业、食品、饮料、能源、制造、法律、金融服务、教育、医疗保健业。同时在中国也拥有日益增多的对中加贸易感兴趣的中国企业会员。根据家中贸易理事会一项统计显示，截至2021年，中国已经成为加拿大第2大经济合作伙伴，仅次于美国。不过当年进行的另一个调查发现，受访企业并不乐观。
In China, one of the things we did is we helped to put people's staff on our payroll in China. So a company maybe isn't ready to go set up a whole operation, but they want somebody in market to talk to customers, to make sure their IP is not being stolen. Just having that general interaction is important. And so we definitely added some members that used that service. And this is important because we did some surveying, and we found that in 2021, people told us that overall, Canadian companies were, the news wasn't good. Less profitable, less optimistic, very negative. However, if you separated out the companies with operations or people on the ground, those were more profitable, more optimistic, more likely to expand. And the problem is that when you compare us with the Americans, the Europeans, the Brits, we were falling behind all of those competitor countries. This is bad. This is bad for Canada's global competitiveness if we are lagging. And those countries tend to have companies that made investments earlier or have bigger operations on the ground in China. So I think Canada was really impacted by the last, 4 years now, because in 2019, with the 3 M's, as we call it, to Meng Wanzhou and the 2 Michaels, Many business people said, I'm not going to travel until this is resolved. So you had that year, and then 3 more years during COVID. And so if you were relying on your vice president of sales to go to China 4 times a year to meet customers, or your partners at a law firm going to discuss deals, then you didn't do anything over the last 4 years. So that's that was a big issue, I think, for Canada.
如今，新冠疫情在全球消退之际，加中两国之间复杂而微妙的关系又不可避免笼罩在地缘政治、通胀高企、经济低迷等阴影之下。尤其是联邦政府跟随美国采取对华强硬立场，涉及台海局势、俄罗斯入侵乌克兰、外国政府干预大选等外交内政的敏感领域，多方都关注接下来到底会发生什么。加拿大经济前景，特别是企业发展何去何从？
At the end of the 20th Party Congress, Xi Jinping closed his speech by saying there's a lot of rough seas and high winds in the world. So you have essentially the geopolitical environment, which is really unstable. And the Ukraine-Russia situation has made that even worse. And then you have Canada-China relations, which is a frozen block of ice. So it was frozen before the 3Ms was resolved. And when that was resolved, a big cultural difference between Canada and China became very apparent. The Chinese side said, okay, that's done. What's next, right? Much as we were saying that now in China, people don't talk about COVID. COVID is done, behind us. What's next? What's in the future? The Canadian side, which, many Western countries are much more concerned about black and white, right and wrong, truth with a capital T, as they called it. The Canadian side froze their block of ice even colder. And so it's been really hard to get things restarted. Below that, though, you have some rivers flowing in the water. So business will always get done. People-to-people relations will help to carry that along. And that's one of the roles we play at CCBC. When the relationship is bad, we can often help keep things going. Now, our perspective is that Canada's relationship with China should make sure, it should be good for both, but it definitely has to be good for Canada. So what's good for Canada, right? Canada making sure its laws are followed on its own soil is, of course, paramount, right? So election interference, there's no patience in Canada for that.
高世如认为，加拿大的繁荣有赖与尽可能多的国家，尤其是中国进行对话、接触和有效的沟通，在多个领域有责任保持竞争力。
I've heard 3 things in my time at CCBC that will lower the temperature of a room really fast if you're having a conversation. One is, can I bring my own labor? I had a meeting with a Chinese investor, and on the Canadian side, we're very enthusiastic deal makers. And the minute the CEO said, what about labor? Can I bring my own? Nothing, right? There's no patience for that. Same thing with freedom of the press and free elections. So that's a non-starter. But also what's in Canada's best interests is that we are able to compete fairly in a market like China. And what we can see is that some of our allies, the US specifically says to its allies, don't do business with China, China's bad, China is this, that. And yet, the US is stealing our market share in many products. So in pet food, we lost half of our market share last year, where we are not able to export to China because of avian flu concerns. Those same concerns exist in the US, but the US increased its sales by 265%. So we need to fight for that. Some of our factories that are making pet food in Canada have had to stop producing and move the production down to the US so that they can keep selling to that fast-growing market. So that's worth fighting for on the Canadian side. That's one of the few positive signs we have seen in surveys. And if you look at the thousands of Tim Hortons stores, or the Canada Goose brand that's doing so well, I think that's a really positive sign. So last year, nobody thought exports would increase because, of course, China's consumption capability was really dampened. But we had another record year of exports, $28.7 billion by StatsCan data. So that's good. That's a positive sign. That means even without trying very hard, there's still some momentum. What happens if we try harder? What happens if we fight for our market access against the Americans or our other allies, for example?
加州贸易理事会委托进行的一项研究显示，对华出口为加拿大创造的价值至少是实际出口额的2.2倍。2011到2020年，出口中国商品增长50%，令到经济贸易往来成为加中关系的强劲纽带和最具潜力的发展契机。尽管内外环境存在重重困难，甚至运营的风险，加州贸易理事会仍然在疫情期间持续举办线上线下活动，为加中政商界搭建平台。最新活动包括去年11月在上海第5届中国国际出口贸易博览会上举办了加拿大展商对接会，12月邀请本国驻华大使 Jennifer May 在多伦多举办加中贸易圆桌会谈。今年以来，就教育、移民、旅游如何促进经贸发展举办多场研讨会等，更计划秋天在北京恢复实体举办加中贸易年度大会。而在外交层面，虽然目前暂时看不到加中关系明显解冻，不过高诗如认为，澳洲的经验值得借鉴。
I think, Australia is a really good example to look at. So Australia has had very similar issues with China, including, exports being restricted for what we would consider unfair reasons. Australia has taken a fairly hard line on many issues related to China. But recently, the Australian government decided to start talking again. They haven't actually changed any of their policies. The policies are still pretty hard line. And yet, things are moving. The talking part is really important. And of any of the countries we might look at as examples, Australia is probably the closest to Canada in terms of being kind of a middle power, smaller economy. And so, it would be helpful, I think, for us to look at what Australia has done to recently improve its relationship with China in pursuit of its own interests.
外界关注何时加中启动恢复双边会谈之际，加州贸易理事会认为，与中国的接触需要透过多条轨道，包括与中方分享为何对某些议题看法不同的各种渠道。一方面要在加拿大关切的问题上推行自己主张，一方面要促进本国持续繁荣，比如在向教育、旅游、环境这类没有明显争议的领域积极合作，创造及把握机遇。以上就是本期的内容，各位观众如果想重温的话，可以登入城市电视网站，点击节目重温当中家国纵横的链接就可以了。我是康凯，下期节目再会。